The call came at 3:47 a.m. Washington time, my phone buzzing with a classified alert I haven't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis studies I conducted in the 1990s. The State Department just issued an emergency advisory. All American citizens in Russia must leave immediately, not should consider leaving, not exercise caution. Leave now. I've spent 50 years analyzing great power conflict. I've witnessed the fall of empires, studied every major war of the modern era, taught thousands of students about the mechanisms of international anarchy. But this is different. This is the signal I hoped I'd never see again in my lifetime. You want to know what real escalation looks like? It's not the rhetoric you hear on cable news. It's not the threats politicians throw around for domestic consumption. It's not even the sanctions or the weapons shipments. Real escalation is when governments start evacuating their civilians from potential adversary territory before the shooting starts. That's the signal even the most skilled diplomats can't spin away. That's when game theory meets ground truth, and the results are never pretty. Here's what nobody in the mainstream media understands yet, and this is absolutely crucial. This evacuation order isn't about protecting tourists caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not about business people who might face inconvenience. This is about removing human leverage before kinetic options become operational. I need to explain exactly what that means because the implications will reshape global security architecture for the next decade. But first, let me tell you about Moscow, December 2021, an academic conference on post-Cold War security. A senior Russian official pulled me aside. What he told me then is now playing out exactly as he predicted. And what he predicted next? That's what should terrify everyone. Great powers approaching direct confrontation follow a predictable sequence. Economic decoupling, diplomatic expulsion, civilian evacuation, military mobilization. We're at stage 3. Stage 4 has a very short timeline once this begins. This evacuation order means Russia may soon become hostile territory where American presence carries unacceptable risk. That's not diplomatic language, that's war preparation. And Moscow knows exactly how to read these signals. I've analyzed 1914-1939, the Cuban crisis. Civilian evacuation typically provides 72 hours to 2 weeks before military options move from planning to active preparation. We're in that window now. Offensive realism predicts great powers compete for dominance when opportunities arise. But here's what analysts miss. When great powers perceive existential threats, they don't calculate cost-benefit ratios normally. They calculate survival probabilities. Russia views NATO expansion to its borders as existential, not inconvenient, existential. I've said this since the 1990s. American policymakers ignored it completely. The evacuation order proves American intelligence now assesses a significant probability of direct U.S.-Russia confrontation in Ukraine or NATO territory. That assessment didn't come from nowhere. It came from classified intelligence showing Russian military preparations that exceeded previous mobilization levels. It came from intercepts showing operational planning beyond Ukraine's borders. It came from analyzing patterns that looked disturbingly similar to pre-war positioning. I need you to understand something. Cold War stability wasn't based on affection. It was mutual fear and clearly understood red lines. Both sides knew the boundaries, both respected them because crossing them meant annihilation. We've destroyed that architecture. NATO expanded despite promises. We supported revolutions in Russia's sphere. We weaponized sanctions. We armed forces fighting Russian proxies. Each step seemed reasonable. Collectively, they created what Moscow sees as intolerable. The Russian official in 2021 was blunt. You think you won so completely you can dictate forever. You're wrong. We accepted temporary weakness, never permanent subordination. We're done accepting it. The evacuation order reveals American intelligence now sees significant probability of direct confrontation, not from nowhere, from classified intelligence showing Russian preparations exceeding previous mobilizations, from intercepts showing operational planning beyond Ukraine, from patterns disturbingly similar to pre-war positioning. What scenarios produce that assessment? Russian detention of Americans as leverage, cyber attacks disabling critical infrastructure, airspace closures trapping citizens, physical targeting of Westerners in false flags, or worst, Russian perception that NATO involvement requires preemptive action. These were theoretical 2 years ago. They're operational contingencies now. Students always ask, how do we know when competition becomes conflict? Watch what governments do, not what they say. Governments evacuating civilians are preparing for scenarios they previously considered unlikely. This crisis has an additional variable. One side genuinely believes it faces an existential threat, leaving no room for compromise. When Russia says NATO expansion threatens survival, they're not using hyperbole. They're stating what they perceive as fact. And perceptions create reality in international politics. The Cuban Missile Crisis resolved because both sides had room to negotiate. Kennedy traded Turkish missiles for Cuban ones. Both claimed partial victory. What's the compromise in Ukraine? Russia demands NATO never expand to Ukraine. NATO insists on Ukraine's sovereign right to choose alliances. These aren't just incompatible, they're mutually exclusive. No middle ground exists between Ukraine can join NATO and Ukraine can never join NATO. This is structural conflict, not misunderstanding. A conflict based on genuinely incompatible security requirements where both sides have rational positions and no compromise exists that doesn't require one side to accept the unacceptable. The evacuation order is the U.S. government acknowledging this reality. We're moving beyond the stage where we pretend negotiation can resolve structural conflicts. We're entering the stage where both sides prepare for the possibility that force becomes the only remaining tool for protecting what they consider vital interests. I want to be absolutely clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not predicting imminent war. I'm not claiming conflict is inevitable. I'm explaining what the evacuation order signals about how American policymakers now assess the probability distribution of possible outcomes. But I am saying this, the sequence we're observing matches historical patterns that preceded great power conflicts. And unlike previous crises, this one involves nuclear arsenals that could end civilization. The stakes couldn't be higher. The room for error couldn't be smaller. And the evidence suggests both sides are preparing for scenarios that were unthinkable just months ago. So what happens next? If historical patterns hold, we're looking at a 2 to 4 week period where both sides position assets, finalize contingency plans, and make final diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. If those efforts fail, we enter a period of acute danger where any incident, any miscalculation, any technical failure could trigger escalation neither side fully controls. The optimistic scenario is that cooler heads prevail, both sides recognize the catastrophic risks, and some form of negotiated settlement emerges that gives each side enough to claim victory while avoiding direct confrontation. The pessimistic scenario is that structural conflicts proved unresolvable through diplomacy, and we discover whether nuclear deterrence still functions when both sides believe they're defending existential interests. I've spent my entire career studying these patterns. I've analyzed how empires rise and fall. I've examined why wars happen even when both sides would prefer to avoid them. I've taught thousands of students about the security dilemma, the commitment problem, and the dangers of shifting power balances. Everything I've learned tells me we're in the most dangerous moment of great power relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The evacuation order isn't panic. It's recognition that the game has changed fundamentally. The stakes have risen exponentially, and the old rules no longer guarantee stability. My phone is still buzzing with updates. More advisories, more intelligence assessments, more classified briefings that paint a picture nobody wants to see clearly. The civilians are leaving Russia. The diplomats are following established protocols. The militaries are reviewing contingency plans that haven't been updated since the Cold War ended. And somewhere in secure facilities in Moscow and Washington, national security advisors are making calculations about acceptable risks and vital interests. They're gaming out scenarios. They're updating probability distributions. They're briefing leaders on options that range from bad to catastrophic. History will judge whether they calculate correctly. But right now, in this moment, all we know for certain is that the evacuation order signals a threshold we hoped never to cross again after the Soviet Union collapsed. We're not in a Cold War anymore. We're in something potentially more dangerous, a hot crisis between nuclear powers with incompatible objectives and declining faith that diplomatic solutions exist. The world changed this week. Most people just don't realize it yet. They're going about their daily lives, worried about inflation and gas prices and what's trending on social media. They don't understand that the evacuation order is a flashing red warning light that the international system is approaching a breaking point. But they will understand. Reality has a way of making itself brutally clear whether we're ready to accept it or not. And when that clarity comes, when people finally recognize what this moment represents, the question will be whether we prepared for it or whether we let optimism and denial cloud our judgment until it was too late. That's why I'm explaining this now. That's why understanding the evacuation order matters, because the decisions being made in the next days and weeks will determine whether we navigate this crisis successfully or whether we stumble into a confrontation that could reshape the world order in ways we can barely imagine. Pay attention. This is history unfolding in real time. And unlike academic history, the kind I've spent my career studying, this history hasn't been written yet. The outcome isn't predetermined, but the warning signs are unmistakable for anyone willing to see them clearly. The evacuations have begun, the clock is ticking, and the margin for error has never been smaller.